In this, the 16th lesson, we come to the period of the United States' dominance in the global economy, combining industrial might with an expanding middle class. Economists and government planners teamed up to convince legislators they could have it all. Although the actual frontier had long ago disappeared, the construction of an interstate highway system in the United States and the expansion of commercial air travel triggered a massive ongoing migration of people and businesses, nurtured and encouraged by enormous expenditures for new public goods and services. In the world of economic policy analysts, the insights of John Maynard Keynes continue to be championed in the United States by a growing list of university economics professors and their government counterparts. What is not generally appreciated is the fact that John Maynard Keynes was both orthodox and conservative to an extent neither his champions nor detractors fully grasped. Yet Keynes underestimated the potential for government to grow in size and spending, while those benefiting most directly escaped taxation proportionate to the benefits received. Keynes supported the progressive taxation of individual income, but he failed to distinguish between income earned by producing goods or providing services and income derived from purely speculative activities that yielded no increase in real wealth. In the United States, income derived from the sale of land and financial instruments, that is, stocks, bonds, mortgage-backed securities, etc., is taxed at a lower rate than income earned as wages or salaries. President Truman was committed to measures that would create full employment, even if this meant continued spending by the federal government. His proposals ran into intense opposition from self-styled conservatives. The result was a compromise piece of post-war legislation. Congress passed and Truman signed the Employment Act of 1946. One member of Truman's Council of Economic Advisors was Edwin G. Nourse, who had taught economics at the Wharton School back in 1909 and 1910 and eventually earned his doctorate at the University of Chicago. Specializing in agricultural economics, Nourse joined the Brookings Institution in 1923, where he remained until tapped by Truman to become chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Nourse stayed on until 1949. When the press reported that he resigned because he was out of sympathy with Mr. Truman's policies, Nourse responded as follows. That's no proper basis for resignation. He makes necessarily political policies on economic matters, and I make my professional judgments about economic matters with a realistic view of the political setting, but without any political commitments on my part. What this tells us is that even when economists are right and can demonstrate they are right, their influence on the political process is tenuous at best. Politics does in fact dictate economic outcomes, and to a devastating extent, politics is driven by powerful vested interests. Another major figure in the development of economic theory and policy during the first half of the 20th century was Russia-born Simon Kuznets. Kuznets migrated to the United States in 1922 and completed his education at Columbia University. He then taught at the University of Pennsylvania from 1931 to 1954, contributing to the development of economic planning and econometrics. Kuznets developed the concepts of gross national product and national income, and his statistical analyses revealed the United States economy was performing well below capacity, leaving labor and capital goods underutilized. Kuznets expressed concern to his fellow economists of the emphasis on growth for growth's sake. He wrote, "The negative effects of growth have never been viewed as so far outweighing its positive contribution as to lead to its renunciation. In many cases, negative results were allowed to accumulate and to become serious technological or social problems because it was so difficult to foresee them early enough in the process to take effective preventive or ameliorative action." Still, one may justifiably argue, in the light of the history of economic growth, in which a succession of such unexpected negative results has been overcome, that any specific problem so generated will be temporary, although we shall never be free of them, no matter what economic development is attained. To the economist with a sympathetic worldview, the message is clear. There must be ongoing adjustments in policy, in taxation, in law, and in regulation to keep the modern economy on a path of sustainable economic growth. The policy tools are some combination of public spending, taxation, debt management, and monetary controls. Arguably, Alvin Hansen emerged as the most influential U.S. economist on public policy in the middle of the 20th century. He is often referred to as the American Keynes. Hansen earned his PhD at the University of Wisconsin and held teaching positions at Brown University, the University of Minnesota, and Harvard. During his career, he frequently testified before Congress on economic issues and offered his views in 1945 on America's role in the world economy. Even before the war had ended, Hansen argued that the United States had a crucial role to play in the post-war world. He wrote, "The United States could make no greater contribution toward the solution of the international political as well as economic problems than that of achieving a high degree of internal economic stability at a level of fairly full employment of labor." One of Hansen's beliefs was that governments need not be concerned with a rising national debt so long as the economy was growing at a faster rate, as measured by gross domestic product. On this subject, he wrote, "A moderate rise in the public debt need not involve an increase in tax rates to finance the growing service charges, for in a dynamic growing country, the gross national product can be expected to rise." The problem with Hansen's view, I suggest, is that the very measurement of economic activity, gross national product, fails to discriminate between expenditures that improve the well-being of people and those that are harmful. GNP increases with virtually every increase in expenditures by government, without regard for whether such expenditures are paid for out of tax revenue, from borrowing, or from central bank expansion in government account balances. Gross national product is defined as an estimate of the total money value of all the final goods and services produced in a given one-year period by the factors of production owned by a particular country's residents. Final goods and services means goods and services sold or otherwise provided to their final consumers. That is, to avoid double counting. Armed with the data gathered and analyzed each year, economists reported on the economy and forecasted where the economy was likely heading given existing government policies and other externalities. A consensus arose among economists that there was a consistent trade-off between the level of unemployment and the rate of inflation in prices. Research by a New Zealand-born economist named William Phillips provided the evidence. The so-called Phillips curve proved to be a less reliable indicator as the global economy became increasingly integrated and as the power of resource cartels such as OPEC were able to claim an increasing share of the world's goods and services. Paul Samuelson, who popularized the work of Phillips, described the new real-world paradigm of the 1970s with the term stagflation. One of the post-war political leaders who understood the modern economic environment was Paul Douglas. After completing his doctorate program at Harvard in 1916, Douglas taught economics for most of the next 34 years. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 1948, he served continuously until 1967. Douglas greatly feared the consequences of inflation, warning, "By wiping out the middle classes and separating society into two classes of the propertyless on the one hand and the rich speculators on the other, inflation paved the way for fascism and communism on the continent of Europe. It is a destroyer almost as evil as war itself. In the eyes of those who want to destroy democracy and capitalistic institutions, it is a cheap way of achieving their collapse. It costs the enemy nothing in lives and treasure. It is really a supreme folly for a nation which is arming against the threat of invasion from without to let this invader, inflation, bring ruin from within." Douglas was also unique in his recognition of the way land markets were subject to speculative booms, followed by serious busts. Taming land markets required deeper analysis and specific policy solutions than was understood by most economists. However, while in the Senate, he did nothing to propose or support the very measures he knew could have a positive impact on the nation's land markets. In his 1971 memoir, he explained his rationale. "As a student, I had read Henry George's Progress in Poverty. I accepted the general proposition that the community should at least share in the increased values it created. By the time I was in the Senate, the single tax movement had slumped. Many economists, by their captious criticisms, had contributed to this debacle." Because of this, and the fact the issue involved local and state governments rather than national, I did not take up this reform. I could not set the whole world aright, and in trying to do too much, I might imperil what I could do. At any rate, this was my justification for keeping silent on this question while in the Senate. Another economist whose views dominated the economic policy debates of the 1950s was Arthur Burns. He was born in what is today the Ukraine, and his family came to the United States when he was quite young. In 1934, he earned his doctorate at Columbia University. He became chairman of President Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors in 1953, remaining until 1956. In 1957, Arthur Burns delivered a series of lectures at Fordham University on how to achieve prosperity without inflation. He offered his observations on the state of economics as an analytical tool. He stated, "If economists could speak with a clear and authoritative voice on the subject of inflation, there would be nothing to do except to dust away confusion. Economic knowledge has not yet reached that state, and perhaps it never will." What can be said about Arthur Burns is that he was not unusual in his failure to recognize or acknowledge the inherently dysfunctional nature of land markets and the role played by the private appropriation of what I describe as the location and rental values of land. If Burns had ever studied Henry George's works, or for that matter the writings of his own contemporary Harry Gunnison Brown, there is nothing in his own body of work that reveals his views. What Henry George observed is worth repeating. Land is required for the exertion of labor and the production of wealth. Therefore, to control the land is to command all the fruits of labor, except only enough to enable labor to continue to exist. What the average person understands is that private claims to rising land values, driven higher and higher by hoarding and speculation, result in a rising cost of acquiring residential property or even leasing an apartment. This fundamental cause of rising property prices against stagnant or falling wages did not escape Henry George's attention, but was by the 1950s almost universally ignored by modern economists. The term land was absent in the index of major textbooks. In 1949, Professor Harry Gunnison Brown wrote an article titled Economic Fallacies and Economic Teaching, published in the American Journal of Economics and Sociology. He offered a long list of fallacies, opening the article with his philosophy of teaching. He wrote, "It is highly important in the teaching of economics that students be taught to analyze various widely held fallacies and that they learn how to refute them convincingly. Any teaching which leaves them the easy victims of such often plausible fallacies is to that extent inadequate and superficial. Any such teaching is not less but rather all the more important when some of the fallacies have had the support not only of many of the politically great, but of well-known professional economists." Brown went on to list 24 fallacies he argued were essential to discuss with students. He ended the article with this interesting statement. "Could it possibly be that the younger generation of economists have given their time so completely to the study of bizarre theoretical systems which, though temporarily of the new look variety, may soon be, and perhaps already are, on the way out, while giving inadequate attention to some of the most fundamental principles and most significant problems of economics, that they must be regarded as in considerable degree a lost generation?" We've reached the end of Lesson 16.